My stepmother banned me from my father's funeral and even erased my name from his obituary. When I told her I was still his daughter, she smirked and said, "Not in the way that matters." I just stared at her in silence. That was 2 years ago. This morning, I watched as she was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs. You think you know betrayal? I thought I did too, when my stepmother banned me from my own father's funeral and erased me from his life. But that was just the beginning of a twisted story that unearthed a truth so chilling, it changed everything I thought I knew about grief, family, and murder. I was only 14 when my dad married Linda, and right from the start, she was a lot. Imagine someone who used networking as a verb and called her nail tech her therapist. On the surface, she was all designer clothes and saccharine smiles. But behind closed doors, Linda was a master manipulator. She meticulously gatekept my dad's attention, his affection, and eventually, his very presence in my life. When they married, she insisted on blending families. What she really meant was that I needed to blend into the background. She had 2 adult kids from her first marriage, loud, entitled, and seemingly allergic to honest work, and she made sure their needs always came first. If my dad gave me $50 for a school trip, she'd dramatically huff, "Must be nice. My kids never got handouts like that." Even though, ironically, they constantly did. If Dad planned a weekend with me, suddenly there was a catastrophic family emergency on her side that required his immediate, unwavering presence. By the time I turned 18, our relationship had dwindled to quick phone calls and the rare, rushed lunch, always when she was conveniently too busy to join. Then 2 years ago, the news hit. Dad got sick. Not the kind of sick you bounce back from. I found out from my cousin, not Linda, because she apparently didn't want to worry me. By the time I raced to the hospital, she was already in full control. Who could visit, when, for how long? I was allotted a few hours a week and only under her hawk-like supervision. When I quietly asked Dad about it, he just sighed, that familiar, weary sigh, and said, "Let's not make things harder than they have to be." That was his way of avoiding conflict, but I saw it in his eyes. He desperately wanted me there. A few months later, the call came. Dad was gone. I cried until my chest ached, a deep, raw pain. Through my tears, I managed to ask about the aita funeral. Linda's voice, sharp as a knife, cut through the phone. "I don't think it's appropriate for you to be there." I thought I'd misheard. "I'm his daughter," I choked out. "And I'm his wife," she snapped. "This is going to be a private ceremony for people who were actually part of his life." I was shaking, pure disbelief coursing through me. "I am part of his life," I insisted. "Not in the way that matters," she said and hung up. Fury ignited. In me. I drove to her house that night, but she wouldn't answer the door. The next day, same thing. Finally, I called from a different number. She answered with that sickeningly sweet tone she reserved for strangers, but the second she recognized my voice, she hissed, "If you show up, I'll have security remove you." I didn't believe she'd go that far, not until I got a copy of the obituary. My name wasn't in it. Not once. It listed her children as his beloved family and completely erased me. I can't describe the kind of pain that inflicts. It wasn't just losing my dad. It was being erased from his life story while his body was barely cold. So, I stayed home the day of the funeral. I sat on my couch, clutching one of Dad's old flannel shirts, trying to breathe through the suffocating grief and white-hot rage. But as the hours passed, something shifted. A cold, clear resolve settled in. If she could cut me out of saying goodbye, then I could absolutely demolish the perfect little world she'd built for herself. Here's where the backstory becomes crucial. Dad had been incredibly smart about his finances. He had a will, and he'd updated it after marrying Linda. She thought she'd get everything. She was so wrong. Dad had left me a 50% share of their house, plus control of a small trust fund meant to cover property taxes and upkeep. I hadn't touched it while Dad was alive, partly out of respect, partly because I didn't want to start a war. But after she banned me from his funeral, The gloves came off. Within a week, I was sitting with an attorney. We reviewed the deed, the trust terms. Legally, Linda couldn't sell or refinance the house without my consent. She couldn't even make major renovations without my approval. And the trust fund? I was a co-trustee. That meant any expenses she wanted paid had to go through me. I didn't say a word to her at first. I just started exercising my rights. Slowly, deliberately. She wanted to redo the kitchen? Denied. She wanted to host a big holiday party? Not. Without the event insurance I now required for any gathering over 20 people. She wanted the trust to pay for landscaping? Sure, but only if she used the budget service I picked. At first, she tried to ignore me. Then she tried to charm me. When that didn't work, she finally blew up, accusing me of trying to ruin her life. I just looked her dead in the eye and said very calmly, "I'm simply protecting my father's assets. You know, the man whose funeral you banned me from." It took less than 6 months before she put the house on the market. She couldn't stand living in a place where she had to ask my permission to paint a wall. When it sold, I got my share of the proceeds, enough to put a down payment on my own home. And the best part? Word got around the family about what she'd done. She thought she could control the narrative, but people started asking why I hadn't been at the funeral. I told them the truth. Now she's the one unwelcome at family gatherings. I never got to say goodbye to my dad the way I wanted, and I'll never forgive her for that. But every time I unlocked the door to the house I bought with the money she thought she'd keep, I thought maybe, just maybe, Dad would have smiled knowing I didn't let her win. But then, just when I thought it was finally over, I got a call that ripped my world apart again. It was the truth about my father's death. I was unpacking boxes in my new living room when my phone rang. Unknown number. The woman on the other end, Bethany Torres, said she'd been a nurse in the ICU where Dad died. Her voice was shaking as she told me she couldn't keep quiet anymore about what happened. My hands started trembling so bad I had to set down the photo frame I was holding. She wouldn't say much over the phone, just insisted we meet in person at a coffee shop called Neutral Grounds. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. The whole night, I couldn't sleep, replaying every memory from Dad's last days in that hospital. When I walked into Neutral Grounds the next morning, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes waved me over to a corner booth. She had a manila folder on the table, her hand resting on it like she was afraid someone might snatch it. Before I even sat down, she slid the folder across to me. "Look at the medication logs from your dad's final week," she urged. The papers inside showed dosage after dosage of pain medication, each one higher than the last. None of them matched what his actual doctors had ordered. Linda's signature was on every single authorization as his medical proxy. I saw the morphine levels triple in just 3 days, even though Dad's condition had actually been improving, according to the notes. Bethany leaned forward, her voice low. She'd tried reporting her concerns to the hospital administrator, Dr. Noah Holloway, but he'd dismissed everything and changed her schedule so she couldn't be near Dad's room anymore. Then came the gut punch. She said 3 other elderly patients with Linda as their proxy had shown the exact same pattern. All of them dying within weeks, all of them leaving behind significant estates. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about my father. This was bigger. After leaving the coffee shop, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, unable to even put the key in the ignition. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I called David Russo, the attorney who handled the estate sale, leaving him a voicemail. Urgent, legal advice about Dad's death. The concrete walls of the garage felt like they were closing in as my brain tried to process it. Linda might have actually murdered my father. David called me back within an hour, and I could hear the immediate concern in his voice when I explained what Bethany had shown me. He told me to document everything, make copies of all the papers, and said we should file a complaint with the medical board immediately. When he asked if I was prepared for Linda to potentially face murder charges, I didn't hesitate. Yes. I spent that entire weekend at my kitchen table, organizing the medication logs, creating a meticulous timeline of Dad's final days with sticky notes and highlighters spread everywhere. Every detail I remembered about Linda's behavior suddenly looked different. The way she always insisted on being alone with the doctors. How she controlled who got information about his condition. The way she'd hover over the nurses when they gave him medication suddenly seemed less like concern and more like making sure they followed her instructions. 2 days later, my cousin Claire called me out of the blue. She'd heard from other family members that I'd been asking questions about the funeral. She said she had something I needed to see and asked if she could come over right away. When she arrived, she pulled out her phone and played a recording she'd secretly made at the funeral when Linda was outside taking a call. Linda's voice was clear as day, telling someone that the problem was handled and the estate would clear soon. Claire had thought it was weird at the time, but didn't think much of it until she heard I was investigating something. I immediately called David and met him at his office the next morning with all the new evidence. He'd already pulled the estate documents and noticed that Linda had filed paperwork to expedite probate just 2 days after the funeral. Unusually fast for someone supposedly grieving. The way everything lined up, the medication changes, the rushed probate filing, the phone call at the funeral, it all screamed that Linda had planned this for months. That evening, Bethany texted me. Dr. Holloway has been asking other nurses about me. He wants to know if I've been talking to anyone about former patients. She was scared he might know she'd contacted me and didn't know what to do. I told her to act normal, go to work, like nothing was different. While David started preparing formal complaints for the medical board and the district attorney's office, I needed air. I drove to Riverside Park, where Dad used to take me fishing every Saturday morning before Linda came into our lives. The wooden benches were covered in frost, but I sat anyway, staring at the frozen pond where we'd caught bluegill and talked about everything, except what really mattered. That last time I'd seen him alert enough to really talk. 2 weeks. Before he died, he'd grabbed my hand and started to say something about Linda, then stopped himself and just squeezed harder. His eyes had this look I couldn't place then, but now understood was fear mixed with guilt. He'd known something. Was wrong, but felt too weak to fight it. A week later, my phone rang at 2 a.m., unknown number. I almost didn't answer. It was Ryan, Linda's son, slurred and angry, rambling about his mom acting crazy since the funeral. He said she'd been burning papers in their backyard fire pit all week and kept calling some guy named Noah at weird hours. I hit record on my phone as he rambled about finding shredded bank statements in the garbage and hearing her yell at someone about keeping their story straight. He mentioned Noah's name 3 more times before hanging up to throw up. David filed the formal complaint with the medical board 2 days later, including Bethany's medication logs and Claire's recording. The board sent back a form letter, saying they'd initiated an investigation that would take 60 to 90 days minimum for initial review. I wanted to scream at the timeline, but David reminded me that solid cases took time to build properly. My phone rang the next afternoon. It was Linda's number, for the first time since she'd banned me from Dad's funeral. Her voice dripped, with fake sweetness as she asked how I was doing, then casually mentioned she'd heard I'd been asking questions about Dad's care. She said she'd hate for me to upset myself with conspiracy theories when I should be focusing on healing and moving forward. The threat hung in the air. I stayed silent, letting her reveal more with each nervous word. She mentioned that Dr. Holloway was concerned about me harassing his staff and that maybe I needed professional help to process my grief properly. I still said nothing. She finally hung up after warning me that spreading lies about good people had consequences. Bethany texted me to meet at a Starbucks downtown the next morning. She slid another manila folder across the table. Inside were printouts from a charity website showing Linda and Noah serving on the same hospital foundation board 15 years ago, long before Dad met her. There were photos from galas where they stood together, smiling, and donor lists showing they'd co-sponsored several events. Bethany pointed to a newspaper clipping about the charity being investigated for financial irregularities right before Linda left the board. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "This wasn't random. I think your dad was targeted from the beginning." David called me to his office the following week. He'd spread property records across his conference table like a timeline of desperation. Linda had tried to refinance Dad's house 3 times in the year before he died. Each application denied because the trust required my signature. The loan amounts got bigger each time, starting at $200,000 and ending at $500,000. The final application was submitted just 2 weeks before Dad went into the hospital for what was supposed to be routine surgery. David pointed out that each denial letter referenced the trust structure that protected my inheritance as the blocking factor. My apartment felt too quiet that night as I lay in bed, replaying every interaction with Linda since she'd married Dad. I remembered her face when Dad told her he'd updated his will to protect my share of everything they owned. She'd smiled, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her wine glass, talking about how families should trust each other completely. The way she'd said trust sounded like a threat even then, but I'd been too young to understand it. Claire showed up at my door 3 days later with her laptop and a flash drive full of photos from Dad's funeral. She'd been in the parking lot during the reception I'd been banned from, and she'd caught Linda meeting with Noah near the dumpsters. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., while everyone else was inside eating finger sandwiches and sharing memories I wasn't allowed to hear. Noah was waving his arms, pointing at Linda while she held up her hands like she was trying to calm him down. In one photo, his face was red and angry, while Linda looked scared for the first time I'd ever seen. 3 weeks after Bethany first called me, she texted in a panic. The medical board had contacted her for a formal interview that morning. By lunch, she'd been suspended from work pending an internal investigation into breach of patient confidentiality and unauthorized access to medical records. She was crying when she called, saying she couldn't afford to lose her job and her nursing license over this. David immediately drove to the hospital with papers for a whistleblower protection claim, arguing her suspension was illegal retaliation for reporting suspected patient harm. He also filed subpoenas for all patient records where Noah was the attending physician, and Linda was listed as family contact or healthcare proxy. The next morning, Claire called and asked me to come over because she'd found some old photo albums from family gatherings. I drove to her small kitchen where she had boxes spread across the table. We started flipping through pictures from 2 years ago, when Dad looked completely healthy and strong. Claire pointed at one where he was lifting her daughter onto his shoulders at a birthday party. She said quietly that he should have had at least 10 more good years. I nodded and kept turning pages until my phone rang with Ryan's name on the screen. His voice sounded different this time, sober and actually worried instead of drunk and angry. He told me his mom had been moving money between different bank accounts all week. She'd mentioned something about Noah's plan falling apart and needing to cover their tracks. He was starting to realize his mother might actually be involved in something really bad. I told him to write down everything he remembered and called David's office immediately. 2 days later, I met Bethany at a park near the hospital where she completely broke down crying. She kept saying she couldn't afford to lose her nursing license or her job with 3 kids at home. I promised to cover all her legal fees and any wages she lost from this whole mess. I told her my father would have wanted the truth to come out, no matter what it cost. She wiped her eyes and hugged me before heading back to her car. That afternoon, David called me from his office, sounding angry for the first time since I'd known him. Linda's lawyer had sent him a cease and desist letter, threatening to sue for defamation if I kept spreading what they called malicious lies. David immediately filed a formal criminal complaint with the Milwaukee Police Department that same day. He said the threat just proved they were getting scared, and we were on the right track. About a month passed with mostly paperwork and waiting before my phone rang with an unknown number. A woman introduced herself as Detective Sophia Smith from the Milwaukee PD Fraud Division. She wanted to schedule an interview about my father's death and the allegations we'd made. She explained they were opening a formal investigation into potential medical fraud and elder abuse at the hospital. The case was officially active, and they'd be contacting everyone involved for statements. 3 nights later, someone knocked on my door around 11 p.m. It scared me. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Jessica, Linda's other daughter, standing there looking completely terrified, glancing over her shoulder. When I opened the door, she practically fell inside and started talking really fast about her mother. She'd overheard Linda on a phone call with Noah discussing how to eliminate loose ends before the investigation got deeper. Jessica was convinced her mother might target her next, since she knew too much about their relationship. I grabbed my keys and drove her straight to David's office, even though it was almost midnight. He met us there and took Jessica's written statement. She revealed everything. She knew about her mother's activities. She explained that Linda had been using her old nursing textbooks to research specific medications and their interactions. This research started months before my father even got sick, which made everything so much worse. Jessica showed us photos she'd taken of her mother's notes about drug dosages and interaction effects. The next week, Detective Johnson called Noah in for questioning at the police station downtown. Noah showed up looking nervous, constantly wiping sweat from his forehead during the interview. He claimed Linda was just a concerned wife, making normal medical decisions for her sick husband. But when the detective asked about the pattern of similar deaths and his long relationship with Linda, he couldn't explain anything. He kept changing his story and contradicting himself, which the detective meticulously noted in his report. Meanwhile, I went through the storage unit where I'd kept Dad's belongings after selling the house. I found a journal he'd been keeping during his final months that I hadn't known existed. His handwriting got shakier as the pages went on. He wrote about feeling foggy after Linda's visits. He wondered if his medications were right, and why he felt worse after she helped with his pills. Reading his confused thoughts about trusting his wife while sensing something was terribly wrong made me sick to my stomach. The next day, David got a call from the lawyer representing Bethany with surprising news. 2 other nurses from the hospital had contacted them, wanting to share similar concerns about Noah. They'd been too scared to speak up before, but Bethany's courage had inspired them to come forward. Finally, the investigation picked up speed after that, and David said we needed to meet with the detective again to go over everything we'd found so far. 6 weeks had passed since that first hospital call, and I was starting to feel like maybe we were getting somewhere when I ran into Linda at the grocery store near my new house. I was loading bags into my car when I heard her voice behind me, and my whole body went cold. She was standing there, blocking me between 2 cars, and her face looked different, thinner and older somehow. She moved closer, and I could smell that same expensive perfume she always wore, but now it made me want to throw up. "You have no idea what you're destroying," she said in a low voice that didn't even sound like her. I pulled out my phone and started recording without even thinking about it, holding it down by my side but making sure it was pointed at her. She kept talking, saying my father was going to die anyway, and at least this way it meant something, whatever that was supposed to mean. Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking around like she was scared someone would see us. I told her to get away from me, but she grabbed my arm and squeezed hard enough to leave marks. That's when another shopper walked by and asked if everything was okay. Linda let go immediately, putting on that fake smile she was so good at. She walked away fast, but not before telling me I'd regret this, that I didn't understand what I was messing with. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely drive home. I called David right away to tell him what happened. He had me come to his office immediately, and we played the recording for Detective Williams, who listened to it 3 times before calling for backup. The detective said Linda had basically confessed on that recording, and they were issuing an arrest warrant right away. 2 officers went to her house that same afternoon, but when they got there, she was already gone. Her car was still in the driveway, and the neighbors said they saw her loading suitcases into a taxi earlier that morning, before she'd even confronted me at the store. The house was a mess inside, drawers pulled open and clothes thrown everywhere, like she'd packed in a huge hurry. Ryan called me that night crying, which was weird because we'd never really talked much before. His mom had emptied their joint bank account and left him a note saying she'd be in touch when things calmed down. She'd taken everything, even money from his sister Jessica's college fund, and just disappeared without telling her own kids where she was going. He kept saying he couldn't believe she'd abandoned them like that, but I wasn't surprised at all. Linda only ever cared about Linda. The medical board started looking into Noah's other cases after they heard about the investigation, and what they found made everyone sick. Over 5 years, they found 17 patients who died under weird circumstances, and every single one had money and some connection to either Linda or Noah. Some were friends of Linda's from her country club, others were patients Noah had personally taken over from other doctors. The patterns were all the same: medications being changed right before they died, and family members being kept away during their final days. Each death looked natural on paper, but when you put them all together, it was obvious something terrible had been happening. 2 months had passed since that first hospital call when I finally went to visit Dad's grave for the first time since the funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I'd been putting it off because I didn't know if I could handle it. But I needed to tell him about everything that was happening. The cemetery was quiet, and I sat there on the cold ground, talking to his headstone about the investigation, promising I'd get justice for him. Claire showed up while I was there. She must have known I'd finally worked up the courage to come because she just sat down next to me without saying anything. We held each other, and I cried harder than I had since he died, finally letting myself feel all the grief I'd been pushing down while fighting Linda. David called me to his office the next week because the FBI had joined the investigation. Since Linda had crossed state lines, they thought there was interstate fraud involved. They told us she'd been tracked to a hotel in Chicago, but she was using a fake ID, and they were still trying to pin down her exact location. The agent said it was only a matter of time before they caught her, but I could tell they were frustrated she'd gotten such a head start. That same day, Noah got arrested right in the hospital lobby in front of all his coworkers and patients. They charged him with medical fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. And Bethany was there, watching from across the lobby when they put him in handcuffs. She looked sad, even though she'd been vindicated because this whole thing went against everything doctors were supposed to stand for. The investigation kept growing, and soon 17 families had joined a civil suit against the hospital, Noah and Linda. David and I spent hours going through all the case files. The hospital's insurance company was already pushing for a settlement because they knew how bad this would look in court. Jessica called David's office one day asking to meet, and she brought a laptop full of emails between her mom and Noah. They'd been using the phrase the Milwaukee Protocol as code for their scheme. She had dozens of messages where they discussed which patients to target and how to split the money. The detective gave her immunity in exchange for her cooperation, and she seemed relieved to finally tell someone what she knew. I wasn't sleeping or eating right anymore. I kept checking the locks on my doors over and over, scared Linda would show up at my new house, even though the FBI said she was hundreds of miles away. 3 days later, David called me at 6 a.m., his voice shaking with excitement. The FBI had caught Linda at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, trying to board a flight to Costa Rica with a fake passport and $90,000 in cash. They dragged her off the plane in handcuffs while other passengers took videos on their phones. Within 12 hours, she was back in Milwaukee, sitting in a holding cell at the county jail. The judge set her bail at $2 million and she couldn't pay it. They charged her with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and financial fraud, totaling over $300,000. I watched the news coverage from my couch and felt my hands shake every time they showed her mugshot. 2 weeks later, I had to see her in person at the arraignment. The courthouse was packed with reporters, and I wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy outside. Linda walked into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked 20 years older, with gray roots showing in her hair and deep lines around her mouth. Her lawyer stood next to her in an expensive suit while the judge read the charges. Linda kept her chin up, staring straight ahead like she was at some board meeting instead of facing life in prison. When the judge asked how she pleaded, she said, "Not guilty," in a clear voice that made my stomach turn. I noticed she was still wearing Dad's wedding ring and the diamond earrings he gave her for their anniversary. After the hearing, Ryan and Jessica were waiting for me in the hallway. They both looked terrible, with dark circles under their eyes, and Ryan's hands were shaking worse than mine. Jessica started crying before she even said anything, and Ryan had to speak, for both of them. He told me they were sorry for everything, for how they treated me, for taking Linda's side, for spending Dad's money like it was theirs. They said they wanted to testify against their mother and would give back any money from the estate they still had. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked away. The next morning, David called to tell me that Noah Holloway's lawyer wanted to meet about a possible plea deal. We met at David's office that afternoon. The other lawyer was this young guy who kept sweating through his shirt. He said Noah was willing to testify against Linda in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 to 10 years instead of 25 to life. He claimed Linda was the mastermind who seduced Noah and then blackmailed him about his gambling debts to the wrong people. Noah would provide emails, text messages, and recordings of their conversations, planning everything. David looked at me and waited for my answer. I wanted them both to rot in prison forever, but David explained that without Noah's testimony, it would be harder to convict Linda of murder instead of just negligence. My hands were in fists under the table, and I could barely breathe thinking about Dad dying alone while they counted their money. David said we didn't have to decide right away, but the offer would expire in 48 hours. I went home and threw up twice before finally calling David back to accept the deal. 3 months passed with depositions, evidence reviews, and motion, hearings that made my head spin. The pretrial hearing was set for a Tuesday morning, and Linda's lawyer tried to get the whole case thrown out. He stood there arguing about circumstantial evidence and chain of custody and reasonable doubt, while Linda sat perfectly still in her chair. The prosecutor laid out 8 boxes of evidence on the table, including medical records, bank statements, and a timeline showing Linda and Noah were together the night Dad died. The judge spent an hour reviewing everything while we all sat there waiting. When he finally spoke, he denied the motion and said there was more than enough evidence for a trial. Linda's face went white, and she grabbed her lawyer's arm so hard he winced. That same week, Bethany called to tell me she was back at work after winning her wrongful termination lawsuit against the hospital. They had to pay her $200,000 and give her a promotion to head of patient advocacy. She said the hospital implemented new oversight procedures and fired 3 more administrators who were involved in the cover-up. She thanked me for standing by, her when everyone else abandoned her. A week later, I met with the prosecutor's expert witness, a toxicologist from Johns Hopkins who specialized in drug interactions. We sat in a conference room going through Dad's medical records page by page while he explained what each medication did. He showed me how the combination of drugs they gave Dad would shut down his liver and kidneys within hours. The doses were 3 times higher than normal and mixed with medications that should never be given together. He said it was virtually guaranteed to cause organ failure, and whoever ordered it knew exactly what would happen. Each page felt like another knife in my chest, seeing Dad's vitals dropping while they kept pumping him full of poison. Claire called me that night, crying because she'd found something on her dad's old computer. There were emails from 2 years ago where my uncle suspected Linda was having an affair with someone he called Noah. The emails were dated around the same time Linda and Noah served on that charity board together. My uncle wrote that he saw them at a hotel restaurant when Linda told Dad she was visiting her sister in Phoenix. He never told Dad because he didn't have proof and didn't want to cause problems without being sure. The next morning, Linda's lawyer called David saying his client wanted to make an offer. Linda would tell me Dad's real final words and explain what really happened that night if I agreed to drop the criminal charges. David put the call on speaker, and I could hear the desperation in the lawyer's voice. I told him to tell Linda she could take her offer and go to hell because I already knew what she did to Dad. The lawyer tried to argue, but David hung up on him. 2 days later, David called me to come to the district attorney's office immediately. I drove downtown and found the building packed with reporters who shoved microphones in my face as I pushed through them. Inside the conference room sat 3 federal prosecutors with boxes of files stacked on the table. The lead prosecutor, a woman with gray hair pulled tight in a bun, spread out documents showing Linda's name connected to hospitals in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. She pointed to dates going back 7 years and explained they'd found 17 families just like mine. Each case followed the same pattern: elderly patients dying unexpectedly while Linda or Noah controlled their care. The FBI was now treating this as organized crime, and RICO charges were being added. I left that meeting feeling sick, but also relieved that Dad wasn't their only victim. The next week, I found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs at a community center listening to strangers tell stories that sounded exactly like mine. A woman named Carol cried as she described how her mother's nurse wouldn't let her visit during her final days. A man named Tom showed us the obituary where his stepmother erased him, just like Linda erased me. We met every Tuesday, and I started bringing coffee and donuts because these people understood what I was going through. 4 months after that first hospital call, David asked me to meet him at his office about a settlement offer. The hospital wanted to avoid trial and had offered $8 million to be split among all 17 families. I stared at the number on the paper and felt my stomach turn because no amount of money would bring Dad back. David said I had 48 hours to decide, and I spent those 2 days walking around my house, unable to eat or sleep. I finally agreed because the other families needed closure, and some of them had medical bills from trying to save their loved ones. Noah gave his deposition the following week in a room with 2 stenographers and 5 lawyers. He sat there in his orange jumpsuit, describing how Linda would attend charity galas and hospital fundraisers specifically to identify targets. She looked for wealthy widowers or men with strained family relationships whom she could isolate from their children. He said, Your dad was perfect because of your existing tension and his guilt about not standing up to her. Noah explained their system, where Linda would push for specific medications that made patients confused, while he altered medical records to cover the deaths. Jessica called me crying one afternoon, saying she'd found something terrible. Her mother had given her bank account numbers years ago, saying they were for emergencies. But Jessica discovered Linda was accessing them from jail using a contraband phone. She'd already tried to move $200,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. Jessica drove straight to the police station and handed over everything, including passwords and routing numbers Linda had hidden in a recipe box. Detective Davis thanked her and immediately contacted the FBI, who froze the accounts within hours. The forensic accountants found over $3 million spread across 12 different offshore accounts, all funded by Linda's previous victims. The government seized every penny and started the process of returning it to the families she'd robbed. I decided to visit Dad's old house, even though strangers lived there now. The new owners, a young couple with a baby, let me walk through the rooms where I'd grown up. I stood in Dad's study, where he used to help me with homework, and realized I'd been so focused on getting justice that I never really let myself grieve. The wife made me tea and let me sit in the backyard where Dad and I used to grill burgers every Sunday. I cried for an hour on their patio furniture while they pretended to be busy inside. Ryan called me a few weeks later to say he'd gotten a job at a warehouse loading trucks. He'd never worked a day in his life, but said he needed to do something. Honest after living off his mother's crimes for so long. We met for coffee, and he apologized for all the years he'd treated me like garbage. He showed me his first paycheck and said he was saving up to pay back some of the families his mother hurt. I didn't forgive him completely, but I appreciated that he was trying to change. The prosecution kept finding more evidence, including 3 life insurance policies Linda had taken out on Dad without his knowledge. Each policy was worth between $1 and $2 million, and all were purchased in the 12 months before he died. The insurance companies had already paid out, but were now suing to get their money back based on fraud. 2 weeks before trial, the judge held a hearing about Linda's lawyer's request to move the trial to another county. Her lawyer argued that media coverage made it impossible to find an impartial jury in our area. The judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked at Linda and said she created the situation through her own greed and cruelty. He denied the motion and set jury selection to begin Monday morning. David's office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown, and I spent the next 3 days there trying to write my victim impact statement. I sat at his conference table with a legal pad, crossing out sentence after sentence while David reviewed case files across from me. Every time I tried to explain what Linda had done, the words felt too small for the damage she'd caused. I wrote about being locked out of the hospital room while Dad was dying. I wrote about the funeral I couldn't attend and the obituary that erased me from his life. I wrote about finding out she'd been poisoning him with extra morphine doses. David looked up when I crumbled another draft and threw it in the trash. He told me to just write what I'd say to Dad if he could hear me. That helped. By Thursday afternoon, I had 3 pages that made my hands shake when I read them out loud. Friday morning, Bethany showed up at my apartment with coffee and a folder of medical charts. She sat on my couch and spread the papers across my coffee table, pointing to dates and dosage amounts circled in red ink. The prosecutor had asked her to testify about the medication patterns she'd noticed in Dad's final weeks. She said preparing for this had changed her, made her question every order she followed at work. Now, we both knew we'd never be the same people we were before Linda came into our lives. That weekend, I finally opened the last box of Dad's things from the storage unit. Most of it was old tax returns and instruction manuals for appliances he'd thrown away years ago. But at the bottom was a shoebox full of cards and letters, some addressed to me but never sent. One envelope had my name written in his shaky handwriting with a date from a month before he died. Inside, he'd written that he was sorry for not protecting me better from Linda, that he knew she was keeping us apart, but felt too weak to fight her. He said he loved me and wished he'd been brave enough to stand up to her while he still could. I sat on my bedroom floor, crying and holding that letter until the ink started to blur from my tears. Monday morning, the news came through David's office phone. Noah had been attacked in the county jail. Another inmate, whose mother had died from medical neglect, had cornered him in the shower room with a sharpened toothbrush. Noah survived but needed surgery to repair damage to his liver and was in critical condition at the same hospital where Dad had died. The prosecutor called David to discuss whether they could use Noah's recorded deposition if he couldn't appear in person. Detective Miller stopped by that afternoon with more bad news about Linda's plans. They'd found emails on her laptop showing she'd already picked her next target, an 82-year-old widower from the country club named Harold Brennan. She'd volunteered to help organize his granddaughter's wedding and had been having coffee with him twice a week, telling him how lonely she was after losing her husband. Harold's daughter had contacted police after seeing Linda's arrest on the news and recognizing her from the wedding planning meetings. The detective said Linda had been following the same pattern, getting close to the family, becoming indispensable, positioning herself as the caring companion. Sunday night before the trial, everything hit me at once. Claire found me on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m., unable to breathe, my chest feeling like someone was sitting on it. She helped me to the couch and sat with me while I gasped and shook, reminding me to count my breaths. She stayed awake with me until sunrise, making tea and telling me Dad would be proud of what I was doing. She said he'd want me to be strong in that courtroom, to tell the truth about what Linda had done. Monday morning, the courthouse was packed with reporters and cameras when we arrived for the first day of trial. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Rodriguez with gray streaks in her black hair, stood up for opening statements and told the jury they would hear evidence of a calculated murder disguised as medical care. She described Linda as a predator who had isolated a dying man from his daughter, manipulated his medications, and stolen not just his money, but his final moments with his family. Linda's lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone, argued that Linda was a devoted wife who had made difficult medical decisions while caring for a terminally ill husband. He said the prosecution was trying to criminalize compassion and that Linda's only crime was loving a man whose daughter had abandoned him. I had to dig my nails into my palms to keep from standing up and screaming at his lies. Tuesday was my turn to testify, and my legs shook as I walked to the witness stand. Linda stared at me the entire time, her lips pressed into a thin line, trying to make me look at her instead of the jury. Janet asked me about the funeral, and I described getting the call that I was banned, driving to Linda's house, being threatened with security if I showed up. I told them about the obituary that listed Linda's children, but not me, about being erased from my father's life story while his body was still warm. One juror wiped her eyes when I read the letter Dad had written, apologizing for not protecting me from Linda. When Linda's lawyer cross-examined me, he suggested I was angry about the inheritance and looking for revenge, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. Wednesday afternoon, Bethany took the stand with a cart full of medical charts and records. She walked the jury through each morphine dose, showing how the amounts increased whenever Linda was alone with Dad. She pointed to her own notes in the margins, where she'd questioned the dosages but been overruled by Dr. Holloway. Linda's lawyer tried to paint her as a disgruntled employee with a grudge against the hospital administration, but Bethany's detailed documentation spoke louder than his accusations. She'd kept copies of everything, photographed prescription logs, even recorded conversations with Dr. Holloway on her phone when he'd ordered her to increase the morphine despite Dad's stable condition. The judge called for a recess after Bethany's testimony, and when we came back 3 days later, the TV screens were set up for Noah to testify from his hospital bed. He looked bad, really bad, with tubes coming out of his arms and a neck brace keeping his head still. The prosecutor asked him to explain what happened with my dad and the other patients. Noah started slow, his voice scratchy through the video feed, describing how Linda would come to his office with cookies and coffee. She'd ask questions about pain management protocols and end-of-life care, always framing it like she was worried about her husband's comfort. He said she knew exactly which medications would speed up organ failure without raising red flags. She'd researched combinations that looked like natural decline in sick patients. Linda jumped up from her seat and screamed that he was lying, that he was trying to save himself. The judge banged his gavel and told her lawyer to control his client or she'd be removed. Noah kept talking, explaining how Linda would cry in his office about watching Dad suffer. She'd beg him to increase the morphine, saying Dad was in pain even when the nurses said he was comfortable. The next witness was Jessica, and I couldn't believe she was actually going to testify against her own mother. She walked to the stand without looking at Linda, her hands shaking as she took the oath. Jessica told the court about growing up with Linda's obsession with money and status. She described how her mother would practice emotions in the mirror, getting her crying just right for different situations. The morning of Dad's funeral, Jessica had walked in on Linda practicing her grieving widow face. Linda had laughed and said she needed to look perfect for the cameras since some distant relatives were wealthy. During the lunch recess, I went to the bathroom and found Linda already there, fixing her lipstick. She turned to me and whispered that Dad had begged for those drugs. She said he wanted to die rather than keep living with a daughter who'd abandoned him. I recognized the manipulation, but it still hurt. So I just washed my hands and left without saying anything. That evening, I sat with Claire at my kitchen table, going through Dad's journal that the police had returned. We found an entry from 2 months before he died where he wrote about being scared of Linda. He said she was becoming someone he didn't recognize, cold and calculating about everything. He'd written that he wished I could visit more without it causing fights, that he missed our Sunday breakfasts. The next morning, the prosecution brought out their financial expert who traced Linda's offshore accounts. The jury leaned forward as he showed charts of money moving through shell companies for 3 years before Dad got sick. He explained how Linda had researched each victim's family situation, looking for people with strained relationships with their kids. She'd specifically targeted patients whose families wouldn't ask too many questions about their deaths. 2 days later, Linda's defense team called their witnesses, mostly people from her book club and charity committees. They all said she was devoted to Dad, always talking about his care and comfort. But when the prosecutor cross-examined them, they admitted they'd never actually seen Linda with Dad. They'd only heard her stories at lunches and meetings, never witnessed their actual relationship. One woman admitted Linda had asked her to testify and offered to make a donation to her charity. Then Linda took the stand herself, and she put on the performance of her life. She cried about being persecuted by a jealous stepdaughter who'd always hated her. She claimed I was angry about the will and trying to destroy her out of spite. But when the prosecutor started asking specific questions, her story fell apart. She couldn't explain the offshore accounts or why she'd researched those specific medications. She contradicted herself about Dad's condition, first saying he was in terrible pain, then claiming he was peaceful. The prosecutor pulled up her text messages to Noah where she'd written about needing to speed things up. During cross-examination, they played the recording I'd made in the parking lot where she'd admitted everything. Linda tried to claim I'd edited it, that her words were taken out of context, but the forensic expert confirmed the recording was authentic and unaltered. Linda finally admitted she'd said those things, but claimed she was just angry and exaggerating. After her testimony, I couldn't sit in that courtroom anymore and went outside to the steps. David found me there, sitting with my head in my hands, trying to process everything. He reminded me that whatever the verdict, I'd already won by exposing the truth. He said 3 other families had come forward after seeing the news, wondering about their own relatives' deaths. We'd stopped her from hurting anyone else, and that mattered more than any verdict. The last witness that day was Ryan, and watching him take the stand was hard. He looked broken, nothing like the cocky guy who used to make fun of me at family dinners. He testified about finding documents his mother had tried to burn after his stepfather died 2 years ago. He described her relationship with Noah, how they'd been secretly meeting for months before his stepfather got sick. Ryan broke down crying as he apologized to me, saying he should have seen what she was doing. He said he'd been too focused on the money she gave him to question where it came from. The prosecutor stood up the next morning for closing arguments and walked slowly to the jury box, placing his hands on the rail as he looked at each juror one by one. He pulled out a thick folder and started laying out photos on a board. My dad's, hospital records, bank statements showing the transfers, text messages between Linda and Noah that they'd recovered from her deleted files. He pointed to each piece of evidence and explained how Linda had planned everything, how she'd slowly increased Dad's medication doses, how she'd made sure she was always the one giving him his pills, how Noah had changed the medical charts to hide what was really happening. The prosecutor's voice got louder as he talked about the other families, showing pictures of 3 other elderly patients who'd died under similar circumstances when Linda was around. All of them leaving. Money behind that somehow ended up connected to her accounts. Linda's lawyer got up next and straightened his tie before walking to the jury, claiming the whole case was built on coincidence and that Linda was just an easy target because people didn't like her personality. He said Noah was trying to save himself by blaming Linda, that there was no direct proof she'd actually given anyone the wrong medicine, that being a bad stepmother didn't make someone a killer. The jury left to deliberate, and I found myself in the courthouse waiting room with Claire holding my hand, David checking his phone every few minutes. And then Ryan and Jessica walked in and sat across from us. None of us talking, but all of us waiting for the same thing. I couldn't sit still anymore, so I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. Kneeling by his headstone and running my fingers over his name carved in the granite. I told him about the trial, about finding the strength to fight Linda, about how I wished he could see what was happening. And right then, the wind picked up and rustled through the oak trees above me, making me feel like maybe he was listening somehow. 2 days passed with no word from the jury until finally the bailiff called us back to the courtroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The foreman stood up with a piece of paper shaking in his hands and read, "Guilty. On all counts. Murder, conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, elder abuse." Linda just collapsed in her chair while her lawyer grabbed her arm to steady her. The judge banged his gavel and said sentencing would be in 6 weeks, ordering Linda to be held without bail since she was now a convicted felon. 2 officers came over with handcuffs while she stared at me with pure hate in her eyes, but didn't say a word. Outside the courthouse, families of the other victims surrounded me. An elderly woman grabbed my hands and thanked me through tears. A middle-aged man said I'd given his mother justice. Reporters shoved microphones at me, but I just shook my head and said the verdict spoke for itself. That night, I cooked pasta at my house for Claire, Bethany, and David, and we raised our glasses of wine to Dad's memory, to justice finally being served. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I could actually take a deep breath without feeling like my chest was being crushed. A week later, I sat in the same courtroom for Noah's sentencing, watching as the judge gave him 15 years with possible parole in 7, plus orders to pay restitution to all the victims' families. It didn't feel like enough for what he'd done, but at least it was something. 6 weeks after the verdict, I stood at a podium in the packed courtroom for Linda's sentencing hearing, my hands gripping the edges as I looked at her sitting there in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed to the table. I talked about losing my dad, about being banned from his funeral, about having my last chance to say goodbye stolen from me, about the months of pain and grief made worse by her cruelty. My voice broke as I described finding out he'd been murdered by someone who was supposed to love him. The courtroom was completely quiet except for people crying in the gallery, including Ryan, who had his head in his hands, and even the court reporter had to pause to wipe her eyes. When the next family stood up, an older man with shaking hands, he talked about his wife dying alone while Linda collected insurance money she'd taken out without his knowledge. Another woman described finding morphine missing from her mother's hospice supplies, the same drugs that killed her mom weeks earlier than doctors expected. Family after family painted the same picture. Loved ones dying too fast, too conveniently. Always with Linda as the beneficiary of new insurance policies or sudden will changes. Linda sat there like a statue through it all, not even blinking, when a man broke down sobbing about his brother's final days. The prosecutor showed bank records on the screen, deposits matching death dates, 14 victims total over 8 years. When the judge finally started speaking, his voice was hard as steel. He called her crimes the worst betrayal of trust he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. He said she'd turned caregiving into calculated murder. Linda's face cracked then, real fear showing through for the first time. The judge pronounced the sentence, life without parole on all 14 counts, to run consecutively, basically meaning she'd die in prison even if she lived to be 200. Linda jumped up, screaming that I'd ruined her life, that this was all my fault. But the bailiffs grabbed her arms and dragged her out while she kept shrieking my name. The courtroom stayed quiet for a long moment after the doors closed behind her. Outside the courthouse, the other families gathered around me, all of us connected by this horrible thing. They were starting a foundation to push for better oversight of medical proxies and wanted me on the board. They said my courage in speaking up had saved other lives. I said yes without hesitation, knowing Dad would want something good to come from all this pain. 3 weeks later, Claire helped me clean out the storage unit where I'd moved Dad's things after the house sold. His toolbox sat in the corner, the one he'd taught me to use a hammer with when I was 7. Instead of crying like I expected, I felt ready to let go of the stuff that didn't matter and keep what did. We donated his tools to the technical school he'd always supported, kept his watch and a few photos, gave his clothes to charity. 2 months after the sentencing, Ryan texted asking if we could meet for coffee. He and Jessica showed up looking healthier than I'd seen them in years, both in therapy now and working to build real lives. Jessica was going back to nursing school with her own money from a job she'd gotten, and Ryan had been saving for his own apartment instead of living off handouts. They apologized again for not seeing what their mother was. They said they understood if I never wanted to see them again. But looking at them trying so hard to be better, I realized they were victims too, in their own way. The hospital settlement came through the next month, each family getting compensation for their loss. I used my portion to fully fund the foundation we'd started and create a nursing scholarship in Dad's name at the university. The scholarship would go to students committed to ethical practice, kids who understood that caring for the vulnerable was a sacred trust. Bethany called me crying when the hospital named her director of their new elder care oversight program, a position they created after everything came out. She promised to honor Dad and all the others by making sure no nurse could ever do what Linda did again. By Thanksgiving, my life had found a new rhythm. I hosted dinner at my house with Claire's family, Bethany, and surprisingly, Ryan and Jessica, who brought homemade pie. We raised our glasses to the people we'd lost, to the strange family we'd become through shared pain and healing. Nobody mentioned Linda's name. A week before Christmas, a letter arrived from the prison with Linda's prisoner number on it. I recognized her handwriting and knew without opening it that she was trying to manipulate me one last time, probably asking for money or trying to make me feel guilty. I didn't read past the first line where she wrote that I owed her an apology. I walked to my fireplace, lit a match, and watched her words turn to ash. The last of her power over me floated up the chimney as smoke. Spring came early that year, and I finally felt ready to plant the memorial garden I'd been planning. I bought Dad's favorite flowers, the yellow roses he'd grown at our old house before Linda made him rip them out because she was allergic. As I worked the soil with new tools, not the ones I'd donated, but ones I'd bought myself, I thought about how Linda had stolen his final moments, but couldn't steal what really mattered. She couldn't take away the Saturday mornings. He taught me to change oil in the garage, or the way he'd hugged me at my college graduation, or how he'd called me his greatest accomplishment, even when Linda rolled her eyes. The garden would bloom every spring. Proof that truth always finds a way to push through even the darkest soil. Dad would have liked that, knowing that in the end, love and justice grew stronger than any lie.